You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis. I'm your host for BioTalk, and we have a treat for you today. We're going to double your pleasure, and it's not double mint gum. It's two people from one of the most innovative federal agencies that's been created in the last couple of years that a lot of the listeners may not have heard about, but those in the life sciences and the biohealth industry probably have heard about it at this time. We're talking about ARPA-H. And we're really pleased to have Craig Gravitz, who's the director of the Project Accelerator Transition Innovation Office. Big title, but it's actually got an acronym called PATIO, and I'm going to refer to it as PATIO from here on out. And Jenica Patterson, who's a division director for PATIO, who works with Craig, and they're going to talk about especially those programs which we focus on a lot nationally and in the biohealth capital region, the emerging biohealth and life science companies that don't have access to all the resources they need to stimulate their growth. So, Craig and Jenica, welcome to BioTalk.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, and what we're going to do is rather than me read your bios from the ARPA-H website, we're going to let each of you add a little flavor to your own introduction. So I'm going to start with Craig. Craig, give our listeners a little background on Craig Gravitz.
Oh, man. Well, first, the most important thing is I'm sitting here in Philadelphia wearing my Phillies jersey because later today, after a wonderful work day where we push forward wonderful innovations here at ARPA-H, I will be going to the Phillies game with a couple of my colleagues. So it's going to be great.
Well, good luck. They're riding high this year.
Yeah, it's been a pretty good year. So I am the director of PATIO, and the reason why my office exists is I seek to ensure that the innovations that ARPA-H program managers, and we'll tell you a little about that role and what programs are in a minute, but suffice it to say is there's a lot of really cool science that we do at ARPA-H, but is an equally difficult challenge to get those innovations out into the real world. And my office designed to have a suite of wraparound services, tools, expertise that will nurture all of these programs and performers and get them out. And throughout the course of this chat, we'll talk about some of the tools that we put in place. But briefly, I'm a licensed attorney, and I've spent the last 10 plus years in government R&D before coming to ARPA-H. First employee, by the way. Before coming to ARPA-H, I worked at the Defense Department and I ran my own R&D program where I did a lot of sprints. And you'll hear a lot about the sprint process as part of this conversation today as well. But the gist is this: it's not enough to just create wonderful science and wonderful innovations. You have to have a way to interface with the real world. And that's what my office does.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned DOD, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get into the introduction of ARPA-H overall, which PATIO is a part of. Now, Jenica Patterson, how about your background?
Great. Thanks, Rich. So I can announce today, it's really exciting that I actually have become the first portfolio lead at ARPA-H in the PATIO office. So that's a really exciting time for us where we're conducting research and development within PATIO. And right now, I started this position with leading the Sprint for Women's Health, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a little bit. But as you said, I served as the director of the Technology Transfer and Transition Division in PATIO. So I helped build that from scratch with Craig. It's been really fun to help build transition endpoints into programs from the beginning, which is really exciting. We also built 3 public-private partnerships, one with your organization, BHI, which has been really helping our performer teams excel and get their innovations out into the market, which is really our goal in the transition office, is to really accelerate things out to the hands of people and out into the market. But prior to coming to ARPA-H, I've been at ARPA-H, I can't believe it, for 2 years, which is basically as long as it's existed, which is really exciting. But prior to that, I worked as a program director at NIH for 5 years, and I got to help stand up and build the RADx program, the Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics program, which I saw things go from research and development into market in 6 months during the COVID pandemic, which was pretty incredible. And I also had the great opportunity to work at the Alcohol Institute on a lot of translational therapeutic programs. And my background, I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I love to crack neuroscience jokes all throughout PATIO, as Craig knows. And it's just a pleasure to work on a team that really embraces diversity in many dimensions, and excited to see all of this translation out into the market and into the world after we're done.
Well, thank you, Jenica, and congratulations on being the first portfolio lead. We have a couple first employee for ARPA-H and the first portfolio lead. So honored to have both of you on BioTalk today.
If I can just brag about Jenica for 1 second, she has been one of my closest collaborators and co-designers here at ARPA-H, and T3X, the division that Jenica previously ran, was really my initial vision for my office. And Jenica and I worked really closely together to design all of these tools and services. Again, we'll talk about that during the course of this, but it was really hard. There's nothing else in the federal government like PATIO and like the division that Jenica ran. And then once we got that division up and running, really supporting programs, I had another hard challenge, which was the Sprint for Women's Health, and we tapped Jenica for that. So I just want you to understand that the go-to person at this agency when you want to build something from scratch is Jenica. She's just an incredible teammate and person, and really honored to work with her.
We all love to have Jenicas of the world that we can work with, right, Craig?
Yeah. There's no one like her, though.
You can't replace Jenica. We know that. We've had an opportunity to work with her over the last year, and it's been a joy to work with her with BioHealth Innovation as a partnership intermediary with ARPA-H. So thank you for that ability to work with you. We've talked about PATIO a little bit, but let's talk a little bit about the overall organization, ARPA-H. And Craig, nobody better than you, since you were the first employee. Talk a little bit about what the mission and the goals of ARPA-H is in general, how it got formed, how it got its name, actually, because, a lot of people say, hey, DARPA and ARPA, what's the relationship there? So, Craig, give us a little background on ARPA-H.
ARPA-H, concept that's been kicking around for about a decade. And what it really does is fill a gap in the health ecosystem. So there are a lot of startups out there trying to build new things. There's NIH, which is really coming up with the fundamental science. But really the gap that ARPA-H is designed to fill are these revolutionary, risky shots on goal where there's just something that doesn't exist in the world right now, but it really has to. And let me define risky for a second. It's not risky in terms of harming people or something scary. It's risky in the sense of that it just might not work. And so we are based on the model that DARPA very innovatively created over the last number of decades. Essentially, what you do is you take a program manager. A program manager is this individual genius, expert in their field. And what they have is a vision. The world exists a certain way now, but they can see the future and think about a world that they would like to live in. Something where, what if your joints could heal themselves? That's one of our initial programs. Or what if you could remove all cancers, even the little bits of it that you can't see? These program managers have this vision of how the world ought to be, and they have the technical expertise to be able to get us there. And so what we do is we hire those individuals. We have a very, very rigorous process, just like DARPA does, for both selecting these people and then making sure we level up their program so that they are taking something that really is big and risky and hard that no one else could do. NIH couldn't do it. A private sector company couldn't do it. The only entity in the world that would take this type of risk and think this big is ARPA-H. We do that. I'll take a pause there and see if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, do you want to talk about other divisions within ARPA-H other than PATIO so that you can talk about the interplay there?
Yeah, for sure. So there are 5 technical offices, and that's really where the scientific innovation happens at ARPA-H. And there's many wonderful other people that all work together to meet the mission. But the easiest way to understand it is through the lens of our technical offices. So I run one of those technical offices, PATIO. We are the interface with the private sector. So when you want to talk about connections with venture, understanding regulatory pathways, how do you work with the FDA? How do you get things paid for? How do you do user testing to make sure that the products and services that we develop are trustworthy to the American public? We do all of those sorts of things. And then there's 4 other technical offices that hire the program managers and really push forward the science that we're talking about. So one is health science futures, another is resilient systems, another is scalable solutions, and the final is proactive health. And perhaps I can kick it to Jenica to maybe give a sentence or two on the types of scientific innovations that each of those offices try to push forward.
Yeah, sure. So I'll step in a little bit. So for the different mission offices, they kind of group them very general, and that was on purpose, just because we want to make sure that we are grasping all we can through the health ecosystem. So I can walk through a few examples of maybe programs that already exist, and just to give you a sense of what we are looking at and for at ARPA-H. So for the health science futures, it's really looking at what is technically possible, thinking about look 10 to 20 years in the future, where could you see the health ecosystem live? And I think Craig gave one great example of our first program by Dr. Ross Urich, which was what if joints could regrow themselves? And essentially what that is instead of going in for a surgery to get a knee replacement, what if maybe you could do an injectable and never have to get a knee replacement again, and your cartilage and your bone could basically heal itself over time? So that's kind of a good example of health science futures of a technology there. For resilient systems, we want to make sure that we are building a more resilient healthcare system. So it could be in the space of AI, ML, it could be in the space of how can we protect our bodies and ourselves to be more resilient. So there's a couple different programs in that space. We also have the Resilient Systems Office. So Dr. Jessica Green actually just launched a program called Breathe. And what that's looking for is to really build resilient environments for air and total health in buildings. So imagine you can go into a building and be able to understand what are those different type of organisms and such that are flowing through the air, and what are the ways that we can reduce the pollution as well as different types of viruses and bacteria within the air to keep people healthier while they're inside buildings.
Excellent. Thank you for those examples. And really, when we go back to ARPA-H and the PATIO office, Craig, what is the differentiation with PATIO and ARPA-H versus NIH, HHS? And how does ARPA-H and the PATIO office interact with other federal agencies, which is not really that common?
Yeah, great question. So the best way to think about this is through the lens of how I designed PATIO. So there is this concept that I became familiar with over the last decade or so. It was popularized by the design firm IDEO. And it's basically, how does innovation happen? And through this rubric, there are three lenses. One is desirability, which essentially are what are the wants and needs of people. You can think of things like affordability for the solution, or is it $1 million gene therapy? Accessibility, is it available in my area? Trust, is this something that's scary, or is this something that makes sense to me as a person and I'd be willing to adopt it enthusiastically? That's desirability. Feasibility is really the ARPA-H story generally that I said at the top, which is what's the technology of the future? So a Star Trek transporter, probably not feasible. Sounds really cool, but we're probably gonna need a couple hundred years to do that. But ARPA-H generally can push forward technologies that seem futuristic, and there is an element of reality that's built into there. And we can really bend that reality to do some things like the Nitro program that we talked about, or the Breathe program that Jenica mentioned. Feasibility is what can we make real today, which seems far off. And then finally, the last bit, which is really PATIO really handles the desirability in this last piece, which is viability. And this is markets. Is there a business model for the particular innovation that you have? Is there a customer base? So not from the customer's perspective, but from the business perspective. And then finally, in the health space, obviously, you need to have regulatory approvals. There's reimbursement, all of these other types of considerations. And so what my team does is work really closely with everybody. So whether it's venture capital or other people in the private sector like philanthropies or government. So we work really closely with the FDA, for example, to understand if you're creating the technology of the future, is there an existing regulatory pathway to approve these types of things? And if there's not, which if we're being sufficiently futuristic, there probably won't be, we need to build it. And so what we do is we work hand in hand with the FDA to sort of plot out that path to getting things out into the market. And that's just one example. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And what I'm going to do is have some playback between both of you on PATIO programs and some other interaction that you have with some other federal agencies now. And really, Jenica, Craig has done a good job of giving the overall perspective of PATIO. And since you're now the first official portfolio lead for PATIO, nobody better to discuss the types of programs you have and the elements of companies and technologies that are in your portfolio. So let's get a little bit about the breadth of the different types of programs and also an introduction to the type of portfolio you have at PATIO.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I'll first start off with my role as the director of T3X, because it was a really cool opportunity to build the mechanisms and almost build the train, I should say, for PATIO and kind of get running and going. So we had 3 different ways that we were able to help our program managers accelerate their program development to be able to make sure that we are really pulling in those transition ready elements into programs to, as Craig says, reduce the barriers to transition by looking at the desirability and the marketability of programs, and also be able to understand how that intertwines with the feasibility of programs. So what we did is we built first a transition mentor program. So that's with one of our public-private partnerships of transition. They're called Digitalis Commons. So they really are bringing these experts out inside into ARPA-H to sit with a program manager to make sure they can understand what are those barriers they may run into and how can they be reduced now. So when we reach the end of programs, how can we transition them successfully? And so far, we've had really great success with them to be able to launch programs, but also it's been a way where we've adjusted even technical areas and programs to be able to, as we look down the path, be more successful at the end. We've also created an opportunity to bring on transition consultants. So those people think about our experts in regulatory, experts in reimbursement, experts in affordability, accessibility, and trust. We also have them sit with our program managers to really dive deeper and another level, another layer into the program to be able to make sure that they understand, for example, what are those endpoints in the regulatory process that their performer teams, the program managers' performer teams, will need to reach to be able to be successful? How can they build that into the milestones into their programs? So we've been really excited to bring those experts from the outside inside into ARPA-H to support that. And we brought on another public-private partnership, they're RTI. So they've helped bring in a lot of our transition consultants, as well as Digitalis Commons. And another area that we built is we want to make sure that we are building small businesses up in the ecosystem for health. And so we run the small business program within T3X, the SBIR STTR program. We have 9 active awards already, and we just had a solicitation out. I think it closed maybe today with 8 different topics. And so we're able to start building our portfolio of small businesses and award those particular small businesses to make them successful and make those innovations successful. And again, we've had the pleasure to work with BHI closely to build out our EIR program, our Entrepreneur in Residence program, to support those small businesses, because a lot of those entrepreneurs may be really big experts in the scientific part, but they really need that expertise in business, marketing dynamics, et cetera. So we're bringing those people on to be able to support our awardees.
One of the things that's interesting, since we've had a chance to work with you directly on some of the SBIR awards and performers, is what's unique is now we're working with a DARPA funded company that is also supported by ARPA. And then there's a National Cancer Institute company that is also working with ARPA. There's a NINDS company that is working with ARPA. It is rare to see this kind of collaboration occurring within the federal government. And I always was worried about redundancy. You'd see programs where people were funding similar types of technologies and companies, but there was no coordination between those companies or those agencies. So, Craig, you want to talk a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, so that is one of the most important points that we could make in this podcast or in any conversation. ARPA-H must occupy space that nobody else can occupy. And one of the key functions of the division that Jenica previously ran, T3X, was looking for duplication. Before we ever launch a program, before we ever award an SBIR, or the process even gets started, what we use those partnership intermediaries with the outside world is we look to see, is another government agency funding this or anything similar? Is something happening in the private sector? We use tools like PitchBook, Crunchbase, whatever. We also use the networks and the entrepreneurs, all of the folks that we know in our networks to sort of do other types of analyses as well. And so before anything ever gets launched at the agency, we are going to take a shot on goal that no one else has the guts or ability to take. And that is just fundamental to our values as an agency. There's nothing that you'll find that ARPA-H does that's similar to anywhere else in the private sector or the government.
Craig and Jenica, thank you for that. I think when we talk about why was another agency needed, and I'm sure that there are people who question that, you both have answered that because you're actually filling gaps that have been unfilled by other federal programs over many years and the many billions of dollars which have been invested in research, but not as much focus on that commercialization side and bringing novel things to the marketplace. So thank you for both for giving that perspective, because I think that's helped educating the listeners on why ARPA-H is needed and how it's differentiated from other agencies in the federal government.
Can I riff on that a little bit? Because
sure you can.
Really
this is
important.
Your podcast, Craig.
Love it. Love it. So we talked about the SBIR program, and this might be the start of where we can talk about the sprint that we're running out of our office. So one thing that's really important to me that I've learned in my R&D career is that you don't want the same old performers doing the same old things. If you're going to occupy space like we are as ARPA-H, you have to bring new partners to the table. That's key to doing new things. And so one of the things that I challenged Jenica's team when we launched the SBIR program, they brought me the initial solicitation. And Jenica will remember this because she looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, okay, now cut it in half. And then they brought me a draft. And then I said, now cut it in half again. And what we ended up with was probably the shortest SBIR solicitation that I've ever seen in the federal government. Because if you're going to do new things, you have to attract non-traditional performers, people who have otherwise not been included in the innovation process. And we took that to another level with the Sprint for Women's Health. And so, Jenica, maybe you could talk about the number of small businesses and the type of engagement that we got from non-traditional players inside the Sprint for Women's Health.
Yeah, so I want to say where we differentiate ourselves too at ARPA-H is we move fast. I always say we move at the speed of relevancy. And our director, Dr. Renee Wegerson, always puts up in her slides a picture that she saw this art that said, the patients are waiting. And we remind ourselves every day that, and that's why we want to work so fast and get things out to the hands of people. And our mission is because we know people are waiting for what we are trying to create. And I think we'll build a better, healthy ecosystem if we get those out into the market, as we say, within 5 to 6 years after these programs. So I think that's just an important point to make. But so for our Sprint for Women's Health, actually our director also identified a large gap and knew that despite women making up more than half of our population in the United States, we are drastically underrepresented in scientific and health research. We weren't included in clinical trials until the 90s. And we also, a lot of the preclinical work was done in male rodents. So we don't really know about our bodies and how we work. And so a lot of the research and a lot of the innovations that were created prior to that were actually focused in men. So because of that, and because at the same time, the FLOTUS team, the First Lady's team, as well as the president, launched their Women's Health Research Initiative, we took it as an opportunity to be able to move quickly and catalyze the field of women's health research. So we decided this in, I think, December. And then Craig and Renee met with me in January and said, hey, Jenica, we want you to start the Sprint for Women's Health. I said, okay, let's do it.
And by the way, here's a budget, right?
Actually, we didn't. Craig and I. So we did due diligence and identified how much money we required. to really catalyze that ecosystem. So it was a couple weeks of hard work, but I think that was the beginning of January. The end of February, the First Lady announced our Sprint for Women's Health, which is pretty incredible. We put together a program in 3 weeks. And it was a really unique way that we did this. We actually were able to bring a group of people to a convening event to sit with program managers that stepped up to the plate to help build our Sprint for Women's Health. Immediately, we had 5 program managers that raised their hand to work with us to build topics. And we brought them experts that they could sit around and understand what are the gaps and opportunities in this space. And once that event was over, the program managers went back to their team. And in a week, they built out topics that they know were, number one, in their wheelhouse, in their expertise, and also areas that really were unmet. So we had 6 topics that were put into solicitation. I think we put out the solicitation March 6th. And that's when we had our Proposers Day, where we had over 1,400 people attend, which is incredible. It was one of the biggest responses we've ever had at ARPA-H. And once we launched our solicitation and closed it, we crunched some numbers, and over half of them were small businesses that submitted. And actually, over half of those small businesses were less than 10 people, which is incredible. It's usually not an area where government can reach. And I really credit that to our Investor Catalyst Hub to be able to reach those non-traditional performers, to be able to know that we are out there, we're ready, listening, hearing you. We want you to work with us. And we try to really lower that barrier for them because we only required a 3-page abstract in the beginning. So really just tell us your idea in 3 simple pages. And really, we received an unprecedented number of applications. And again, over 50% of it was in the industry.
Just to jump on there, because I think it's really important to understand the unique contribution that PATIO has to ARPA-H and how we got here a little bit. So one of my contributions to federal service was taking this process called a sprint. Some of your listeners might have heard of it. It was really pioneered by Google Ventures. There's a great book called Sprint by a gentleman named Jake Knapp. And so in my job at DoD is I took this sprint process that Google Ventures does when they're trying to launch a new product, and I combined it with my knowledge of how the federal R&D ecosystem works. And I combined those 2 things. And that's how I ran a lot of really interesting programs in the Defense Department. And one of the things I wanted to do when I got here to ARPA-H is apply that model here. And why do I want to do that? It's because you bring these non-traditional groups in and you get to work and innovate with companies that you would never otherwise see. Jenica mentioned that we had a very, very brief abstract phase. So there's a 3-page abstract. Then another innovation that I brought from sort of my model is that instead of a long proposal process where you're basically tossing paper back and forth over the wall, which is the norm, we have VC style private sector pitches. So that's sort of the next phase. So you start with your abstract, you down select, then you have a pitch phase. And it's very similar. The concept is that the type of innovators that we want to work with to develop these really wonderful innovations are probably the types of people that might be looking for funding in their other work. And how do they go and get funding? They do pitches. So instead of a government-y type of proposal, why don't we just model that same thing? And that was the next phase. And we're in the process of that right now. And then you just collaboratively work together to build a statement of work, super simple contract, really reduce all of the friction that typically happens in the government procurement process and just make it as close to a private sector style transaction as possible. And the idea is that you can go end to end. So we announced, February, March, and we'll probably have awards done by August. $100 million effort. When else have you seen something like that happening in the federal government? And those are the sorts of things that we can do at ARPA-H and my office in PATIO. Great credit to Jenica to joining this sort of new process and at a much more impactful scale than I had done it previously. So it's pretty cool.
I think what you're both demonstrating is ARPA-H is nimble. And another example of this is in our work with Jenica, one of the things we found out in working with early stage performers is that generally your statement of work, and this is for the listeners, there's a statement of work with every contract that you award. A lot of it has to do with research and development related to the technology. But when you're doing the R&D, there's also the business elements that goes parallel with R&D, like regulatory, clinical strategies, your reimbursement strategies, intellectual property, and all of those things. And what I've found is PATIO is flexible enough to bring in experts with the performers at an early stage rather than doing it in a linear fashion, which traditionally happens in government. And you have to get to a stage before you bring in these other experts. So I think that was something that was recognized very early by Jenica and the PATIO team, that we can accelerate potentially the achievement of milestones and metrics by bringing in the experts when the performers need them, not based on when you traditionally would do this. Jenica, did you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really shines through our SBIR program, and really grateful for BHI and their experts and the EIRs. Like I said, we have 9 active awards. 8 of them have EIRs that sit next to the performer teams to be able to help them meet their metrics and maybe even exceed. We've already had success too. I think we onboarded our first round of small businesses last year, and we put them in connection with EIRs, I think within 2 months of them getting awarded, which is pretty incredible. And just understood what are the areas that they need help in. And there's been some acceleration with our small businesses. We've had an opportunity for these small businesses to meet with the FDA, as an example, or get closer to their inflection points that we're looking for in the awards. So it's still early on, but maybe we do this podcast in a year, and I imagine that we're going to be even further along in that process. So it's been a really great opportunity for our small businesses.
Yeah, I think what we're finding is we probably need to do a quarterly podcast, because you two are both so energetic and enthusiastic about the programs that you're involved in, as well as when you look at the innovation that's occurring within your own agency. It's really dynamic and it's changing on a real-time basis. So we'll do things on a regular basis. So I think the listeners also want to know, how do you determine where the priorities are going to be for future programs that you'd like to introduce to the world? And how do you make those decisions on what those priorities are? And as you mentioned with the women's sprint, basically, you can announce a new program very quickly because it's not real bureaucratic, but at the same time, what is the process you see going forward for making some of these new decisions, Craig?
Yeah. Something that's counterintuitive is that we do not pre-assign a single dollar to condition, a disease, a technology. That's not how we do things. Our agency is bottom-up innovation. And so what we look for first and foremost is that program manager champion that we talked about earlier. You need that person who has the vision of the future. They see the world as it is, and they see the world as it ought to be, and they create a program to get us there. Those people don't grow on trees. And so you can't just say, hey, I would love to have a PM in blah. Now, we certainly go around and recruit and try to find the best and the brightest and the smartest and most innovative people. But the reality is, it's really up to the program managers to come up with those ideas. So it's really emergent what type of programs that we'll launch. And because we have this spread of the 5 different technical offices, you'll have lots of different programs that occupy different spaces. And so that's the typical process. The reason why we have the sprint is to help fill white space. So because everything is so bottom up, you might have a gap that emerges. And one of the gaps is the lack of programs in women's health. And that's what Jenica was really able to fill with all of her work in the sprint. And so I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of the agency. Bottom up, innovation comes from the program manager. And when there are gaps, you fill it with very targeted efforts like a sprint.
Now, I think that's very helpful. And I think the key to this is finding innovative program managers that have a good vision. So how do people who have an interest with good ideas and visions contact, or who do they contact if they're interested in being a program manager? Because I know you're actively recruiting for program managers.
Yeah. So our website, ARPA-H.gov, is the best way. If you believe that you are this innovative person and you have an idea, go to the website. So that's one way. So that's kind of the pull model. The push, us going out into the world, is that we're always actively recruiting, looking for individuals. And I'll just give you an example of one of the really successful recruiting initiatives that we did. So one of the things we do out of my office, again, that desirability, viability, feasibility, one of the concepts that's really inherent in that is getting out of the office. You can't just sit behind your computer and write things and read things and expect things to happen. You have to be out in the world and engage. And the trip that Jenica and I made to Philadelphia, probably about 2 years ago, we met because of my interest in that desirability piece. I was looking for people who is out there in health that has really wonderful ideas, could be a program manager. And the name that kept coming up over and over again was Dr. Bon Ku, who was at the Jefferson Health Design Lab. And so this is a person that I need to meet. So reached out to him, went to his lab, talked to him, kind of explained the ARPA model. He said, that sounds ridiculous. How is that possible? I would love to do that, but I don't believe that that's true. And then we went back and we met with him a couple months later, and he saw all the progress that we made. And he's like, wow, that is possible. And now Dr. Bon Ku is here at ARPA-H, one of our most successful program managers, in the middle of launching his Paradigm program, which is all about mobile health. So you may see Jenica and me, Renee, all of the other folks out there trying to recruit. So either go to the website or expect a knock at your door. Those are probably the two best ways to get a program manager.
Excellent. So listeners, if you have some great ideas, you know how to get in touch with ARPA-H now. So we could go on for probably another hour, but really, because listeners only have so much drive time to listen to a podcast, I want to make certain that we've covered everything that you two wanted the initial podcast with ARPA-H to cover. So is there anything that we didn't discuss that you'd like the listeners to know about the PATIO office or ARPA-H today, Jenica?
I will mention one thing I forgot to say in the beginning is I did work at DARPA. So I was there for 4 years. I had the opportunity to work with Renee, our director, and a couple other folks that are now at ARPA-H. And it's so wonderful to see the excitement moving from DARPA to ARPA-H, but also see the vision of moving things from the bench out into the world. I think DARPA had that vision, but moving it into the Department of Defense. And with ARPA-H, we're really trying to move it out into the world and out into our nation to be able to make a healthier ecosystem. I think it's really awesome to see us stand up the PATIO office, because that's the one thing I remember when Craig was interviewing me, the one thing he asked, he said, well, what do you think was lacking? What do you think we should bring to ARPA-H? And I was like, transition. And we're doing it. And it's so cool to see that. So I'm just really proud of ARPA-H and the PATIO team for building something that really can meet our mission and be able to be successful out in the world.
Well, I want to thank both of you for being on BioTalk today. And we've been talking with Craig Gravitz, who's the Director, Project Acceleration Transition Innovation Office, PATIO, at ARPA-H, and Jenica Patterson, Division Director for the PATIO office, and also the first portfolio lead. Again, Craig was the first ARPA-H employee, and Jenica, the first portfolio lead within the PATIO office. So congratulations to both of you for what you've accomplished in a very short period of time. If you would like to learn more about ARPA-H and hear Craig again, we have an opportunity at the BioHealth Capital Region Forum, which is occurring September 17th and 18th, and Craig's going to be one of our keynote speakers. And if you have a multi-billion-dollar agency that is innovative and entrepreneurial, no better place to get exposed to the director of the PATIO office than listen to Craig speak to everybody again. So, Craig, thank you for agreeing to be a keynote speaker at the BioHealth Capital Region Forum. And Jenica, I don't know what you're doing, but I hope you can come too, because we got some great companies that are going to be presenting as well. So both of you, thank you for agreeing to be on BioTalk today. And we look forward to follow up with some of the success stories, which I'm sure will follow very soon.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.